This episode was made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 146 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm James.
And I'm Luke.
And this week, with the help of special guest Mike Arnzen, we discuss William Friedkin's 1973 film, The Exorcist.
So our guest this week is Dr. Michael Arnzen. He holds 4 Bram Stoker Awards and an International Horror Guild Award for his disturbing and often funny fiction, poetry, and literary experiments. He is also a professor of English in the MFA program and writing popular fiction at Seton Hill University. Welcome back to the show, Mike.
Hey guys, thanks for having me again.
It's a pleasure as always. I'm really excited to jump into this movie. Luke tells me that this is a particularly important film for you.
Yes, it's been with me my whole life. I mean, I saw it in the theater when it came out because my dad took me to see horror movies in the 70s and the golden age of horror cinema. So I was exposed to this when I was very, very young. Like, I should not have been in the theater.
It seems like that's the best way to do it, right? It seems like so many people have a memory of this, seeing it when they're really young.
Yeah. I mean, well, and, you know, films that are rated R often are trying to keep kids out of them. But anyway, maybe we can talk more about that kind of thing later. But perhaps, you know, it was restricted at the time. And I mean, I watch this film almost every year because I teach it, whether I'm teaching a film class, a horror movie class, but also in my literary criticism course. The students aren't necessarily reading the novel. I might share an excerpt that has some, you know, a chapter that might not have a lot of the obscenities in it with the students. But mostly I throw this film at them and ask them to critique it because I feel this movie is one that is one of the best examples of a text that's trying to get you to not think critically about what you're seeing. So in literary criticism, I'm challenging the students to, be able to separate their emotions and their feelings about a text from their actual analysis and interpretation of it. And I think this film is actually trying to block us from interpreting it. So it becomes a challenge that's really an interesting one to grapple with in the classroom. And for audiences in general, I mean, people feel when they watch The Exorcist. Even if they're not Catholic or Christian, even if they hate horror or love it, this movie makes you feel things, and it's really successful at that. And that has benefits, but also disadvantages when it comes to thinking critically about texts. So I think it's a great movie. I think it's fantastic.
Well, you're making me think about how, you know, golden age of horror films in the 70s. This film, it's not sort of like your typical we're trying to scare you film. Like, there's intentions being made by the filmmakers in order to make you feel a certain way. I like what you said about how everyone can interpret something different with the film, and yet at the same time, there's many layers of interpretation to it. So, and you can see it as more of a surface level film. You could see it as a metaphor for abuse, potentially a metaphor for Christianity and faith and all of that sort of thing. It's just, there's so much to it, and it's really interesting how it hits people differently, especially because, you know, it's so visceral in some ways.
And I'm always fascinated by all the stories surrounding this sort of curse of this movie. It's listed as one of the, like, most, you know, controversial films, but then also like a cursed film where, like, you hear stories about people dying after it was shot, or like people could never recover from being on this movie. So I didn't do a ton of research into it other than stuff I've heard over the years. So I'm hoping that we can get into some of that today.
I mean, we'll start it off a little bit right here. I'm sure Arnzen is very familiar with the film. I'm sure he's heard all of this before. But supposedly, you know, the curse, the people dying on the film, there were 9 deaths associated with the film.
Wow.
One of the sets burned. and there was no detection of any electrical fires or anything like that. So it's sort of a mystery fire that they can't figure out, which to me kind of like maybe it's like some religious zealots or something that want to come in and burn down this movie that's being made or something like that. But
or was Pazuzu?
Pazuzu could potentially be the answer too. So with the 9 deaths, there's actually 2 actors who died before the film was even released. It was Jack McGowan and Vasiliki Maliaros. So both of them died. Yeah, I definitely said that name wrong. But both of them died before the film was even released. And wow. Supposedly the actor who played Dennings died very soon after he finished his scenes.
Okay.
So I mean, creepy in and of itself. I watched the documentary called The Fear of God, Making of the Exorcist. And in it, a lot of the actors were talking about how, it's a game of numbers. If you're on a set for a year or so, chances are someone might die, whether it's like a heart attack, old age, whatever it is. But on this film, to have 9 specific deaths is definitely not the norm.
What's your take on all the curse stuff, Mike?
One never knows. I'm a big skeptic of all the paranormal material related to the film. I mean, things happen, I mean, what else can we blame the movie for? The Vietnam War? I mean, it's like, how far do you go with this? So, just wrong place, wrong time for some of those people. But a lot of this is related to the kind of merchandising of the film too. I mean, I think Warner Brothers was more than happy to kind of help spread these rumors around, and I think some of the artists involved and the actors and everybody just kind of climbed aboard and kind of helped spread these myths and create this lore about the movie, including fans too. Like we, who are fans of this film, are implicated in doing the same. It's like it's just like
certainly not the hosts of this podcast would never do such a thing.
Well, like I was going to say, Luke and I, we tend to agree with you. We're skeptics when it comes to this, but and it sounds like I think even the actors in the documentary said maybe we were drawing parallels to things that weren't necessarily going on, but apparently Friedkin. Some of the actors were freaked out to the point that he had one of the priests that was either associated with the filming or sort of like an expert witness that they could go to, came and performed an exorcism or some sort of ritual on the set in order to kind of like cleanse the curse or something like that, which very much speaks like I don't think Friedkin believed in the curse, so I don't know. I think he was probably doing it for publicity's sake, potentially.
Well, if I think the whole myth lore surrounding the film is interesting because it shows how much meaning this text really has for the audiences, as well as just as a historical kind of event that The Exorcist was. I mean, what makes the movie kind of intriguing to me, as much as this whole kind of stories about the making of the movie exist, there's also just the way that the movie itself treats spirituality seriously. That's very rare in the cinema. And, when people talk about this curse or how the set might have been haunted or, people died for whatever reason, but usually it's because the devil was involved, right? That all of this speaks to like how strongly people believe in this stuff. And how a film like this kind of raises the issue of believability. Like, how much do you believe in a God? How much faith do you instill in these religious institutions that we're seeing on the screen? And it just raises the issue so that people can talk about this around the kitchen table after the movie. And I wanted to share this with you guys. When I was growing up in the 70s as a kid, people were talking about horror movies all the time. I was awesome. I lived in Long Island, New York. I don't know if that, if it was different in Kansas, I don't know. But, every week there would be like something. I remember when Jaws came out, The Exorcist, all these big blockbuster horror movies, Rosemary's Baby. I even remember people were talking about Night of the Living Dead.
Awesome.
I mean,
how about The Omen? Omen's another massive one.
The Omen changed my life. Let's not go there because that movie is amazing. It doesn't really stand the test of time. But it changed my life. Anyway, I just wanted to share with you some anecdotes of what I remember growing up in Amityville, New York, when The Exorcist came out. Outside, my dad took me to the theater. I told you guys about this, but outside the theater, when we went to the parking lot, there were all these tracts or slips of paper underneath everybody's windshield wipers in the parking lot telling us we were going to go to hell for watching the movie. I mean, there was like cultural
viral marketing.
Outrage. Maybe it was viral marketing, or it could have been just
I mean, it served as it, even if it wasn't intended. Yeah, last week we had quite a discussion about this sort of thing, because I feel like the story itself invites you to ask, like you said, like, do I believe in this? Is this something that is plausible in the real world? It operates in this nebulous area of it's supernatural, yet it is firmly planted in something that many people do believe in. So you can't just dismiss it as like, oh, this is purely, fictional science fiction or fantasy. It's somewhere in between for a lot of people. And both of us are skeptics. So we talked about how if you're someone who does deeply believe in this movie and this project is going to hit you in a very different way.
Well, almost like a confirmation of sorts, right? Like in the end, the priest finds God and defeats the demon and all of these things. So like you could read it from that perspective as well if you believe in that.
We also talked about last week with William Peter Blatty. I was a little bit surprised to find out that he did seem to be a believer in this. It felt to me like the person who made this story might just be trolling religious people. But no, it seemed like he did believe in this. Do you know a lot about William Peter Blatty?
Well, I mean, I haven't read a lot of his works outside of this and Legion, which, as you guys mentioned last episode, I think was turned into Exorcist 3. I think Exorcist 2 is another victim of the curse, to be honest.
I was gonna ask that. I'm assuming just based on source material. I haven't seen Exorcist 2 or 3, but I'm assuming based on source material, 3 is probably better than 2.
3 is a movie every horror fan must see sometime in their life. It features some of the most disturbing scenes you will ever see in a horror film. It has a lot of talking. It's kind of boring in its own way, but there's so much talking in it that it just starts to creep up on you, because the voices, a lot of the dialogue is by insane people. I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to give it away, but Kinderman comes back, and it's intimated that Karras comes back as well. Dyer is a character. There's just all sorts of interesting kind of play with the original story.
I do have one follow-up question. Do you have to watch Exorcist 2 to appreciate Exorcist 3, or can you skip it?
You can totally skip it. I mean, it would be doing a disservice to Linda Blair, who makes an appearance in Exorcist 2 as the main character. So that film's more about Reagan, and Exorcist 3 is, in my opinion, more about the original priests and Kinderman. It's really Kinderman's story. He's the main character as the detective.
That sounds prime for a bonus episode, Luke. Exorcist 2,
absolutely.
And then maybe we revisit Exorcist 3 and cover Legion at the same time on the actual main feed.
Maybe. I didn't know it had that sort of reputation around it. I like it.
There is a very scary scene in a hospital. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I mean, but you could look on YouTube. Your listeners could search YouTube for Exorcist 3, and they'll see the scariest scene ever recorded.
Speaking of scary, I wanted to ask you... you said you saw it when you were younger. I'm assuming it freaked you out and scared you. For me, it's like it absolutely terrified me when I was a kid. When I watch it now, I appreciate it more for sort of the filmmaking techniques and the messages that are being laid there. But it still is creepy. I was watching it last night, and it's at moments I was creeped out. Is it a movie that you said you watch it every year? Is it a movie that as you rewatch, there are specific things that you would point out that you've realized over the course of sort of multiple viewings? Well,
definitely, and I see something new every time, of course. I mean, I wrote an article about this film. I've written a few, but one of them is a look at the way that the film has been re-released itself over time. and that, you know, it had a theatrical re-release in like 2000, 2002, where it was played in theaters again across the country, you know, 30 years later.
Was that the director's cut version of it, or was it the original theatrical cut?
It was subtitled "The Version You've Never Seen."
Yeah,
because
which I think is the version I watched. I'm going to go ahead and admit I watched that version, and then I realized there was also the theatrical version. I think there might be 4 versions of this movie when I was looking into it. So I don't know what versions you guys have seen, but I think I've seen the director's cut version both times now, because I think 10 years ago or plus when I watched it, it was around this time when it came out in theaters, I think.
Yeah, there's a version that came out around the same time that had that spider walk sequence, kind of an extended spider walk sequence that you could watch in the about the film special features kind of thing. But that was reintegrated into the film for the version you've never seen, and now it's kind of a staple of the movie. It makes no logical sense. I don't know if you want to jump right into the narrative here or not. But that's a scene.
Yeah,
that's
we can
a scene
start
that
it out,
makes no sense logically in the movie. Maybe we could talk about that.
Well, it's, you know, purely going in for the scare there, right? Like, there's a reason it was cut out from the theatrical, and I actually wanted to talk about this as well. As William Peter Blatty and Friedkin disagreed on a lot of things. You know, they worked very closely with the script and with making a screenplay and then moving forward and making it into a shot film. A lot of things got cut, and in the documentary, it was very cool. At the end, Friedkin and Blatty were sort of like still having disagreements, and this was like a 25th year anniversary. So to see them still having disagreements and kind of still like, I don't know. It's funny because Blatty brought up he wishes he had done it differently, so that the film would have he had like set up events differently, so that the film would have. But I think the two major things from the theatrical to the director's cut are the spider walk scene, and then I think there's an extended scene at the end with the two priests talking amongst one another that was in the book that was cut, and I think that sort of goes along with what Blatty was looking for, more happy ending, sort of giving closure to everyone, and I think Friedkin wanted it to be a lot more open-ended and interpreted, and so I think that touches on those two differences for the most part. All right, so I think it's about time we should move into the filmmaker here. William Friedkin is an American film and television director, producer, and screenwriter closely identified with the new Hollywood movement of the 1970s. Beginning his career in documentaries in the early 60s, he is perhaps best known for directing the action thriller film The French Connection in 1971 and the supernatural horror film The Exorcist in 1973. The former of which won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Director. The latter also earned him a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Director. His other films include The Boys in the Band, 1970, the suspense thriller Sorcerer, 1977, the controversial crime film Cruising, 1980, the action thriller To Live and Die in L.A. in 1985, the psychological horror film Bug in 2006, and the dark comedy Killer Joe in 2011. So The French Connection was released to wide critical acclaim in 1971, shot in a gritty style more suited for documentaries rather than Hollywood features. The film won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Friedkin followed up with 1973's The Exorcist, based on William Peter Blatty's best-selling novel, which revolutionized the horror genre, and is considered by some critics to be one of the greatest horror movies of all time. The Exorcist was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Director. It won for Best Screenplay and Best Sound. So, William Friedkin. I'm going to start out by saying that in my research, I actually didn't know this, but he's a pretty volatile director, by all accounts. He has a singular vision, according to the actors in the documentary that I watched. He has a singular vision which he will pursue to whatever ends he needs to. He's somewhat a tyrant on set, and puts sometimes actors in situations they don't want to be. There's many special effects means that were used that ended up hurting people on the set of The Exorcist. Wow. People, a lot of fear, and I don't think there's any forgiving that, but it seems like what he wanted to do, he was able to do. But I think nowadays we know that, like, you don't have to push an actor in those ways to get the performance. Like, guns were being fired off to scare people in order to get genuine reactions and things like that.
Wow.
The flailing around of Regan's character A lot of that was like sort of stunt rigged up machinery that was like used to like fling her around the room and things like that. So people were getting hurt. It was a very intense set by all accounts.
Well, I mean, I would say he is an amazing director, and actually, I think he deserves more kind of acclaim. I mean, I think he's kind of part of the pack with like Scorsese and Coppola, and even Spielberg. He was producing blockbuster films at that time that they were coming up, but I think sometimes he's written off because of his use of genre. That is, like horror and crime films, kind of like, not taken as seriously as maybe a war movie like Apocalypse Now, But like The French Connection was groundbreaking because it had like chase scenes that changed the whole way that people make chase scenes in movies now. Right. Because you take over the city of New York to make these things happen in external shots with like in the real city, and it became very gritty, and sets weren't used and things like that. So to move from that and win the first like Oscar for an R-rated movie doing so, to The Exorcist, which is supernatural, the antithesis of realism, is really an interesting kind of artistic move for him to make as a director. And that's, I think, one of the secrets to the success of this film is that he's a diehard realist trying to, shoot a movie that's totally unbelievable. And you have, Blatty too, who is dealing with beliefs using horror fiction. Before this movie, it was mostly just like silly ghost stories and things like that. And psychological horror is where the realism was. So then in this movie, we get Father Karras, who's a psychologist. So it's really interesting the way this movie kind of plays off realism and supernaturalism. And it's happening throughout in many different ways, just little subtle things to, from children's games to film, like, Chris McNeil's an actress and movie maker. And that's put in contrast with the police and the realism, the skepticism that Father Karras has. Kind of makes him a cynical realist in his own job as a priest. It's really just fascinating the way that realism versus unreality are constantly put in these opposite realms and structured. The movie structures opposites really in an interesting way.
Along those same lines, I was noticing science and like the medical scenes in particular were shot in a way to where they were horrifying, but they were also just like cold and impersonal and unhelpful. They looked like they were just torturing Regan. Oh, which, by the way, like the movie can't even decide how to pronounce this name. Different characters call her Regan at times in the film. I swear I heard Regan a few times. I did hear the mother say Reagan at the start, so I will stand corrected. But I defend the fact that I think there are several characters who call her Regan. Anyway, beside my point. In the hospital, it's like science isn't helping. Look at how horrible it is, and then you juxtapose that with a lot of the sort of welcoming and warm, vestiges of Christianity and these priests who are more kind and gentle. Ultimately, science is not the savior here; it's faith. So once again, you're putting, like you said, realism versus the supernatural in a way. To where it felt like to me the message was, maybe don't turn to science, maybe turn to faith. Which I don't know if I agree with that message. So like I have like weird feelings about this movie because in some ways I disagree with a lot of the messaging, but I can still recognize like the masterclass of filmmaking that it is, and the storytelling is very well done. But just like on a personal level, I find that I have disagreements with its like thesis.
I think that's what Friedkin sort of wanted out of the film as well, because like there's a reason why Blatty wasn't like he disagreed with him so often, because Blatty was going from a religious background. He was coming from a more religious background, and then you have Friedkin come in with his we were talking about the French Connection, like very grounded, gritty style, like sort of, and then he goes and tackles something supernatural like this, and I think he allows you to ask both questions and kind of answer them depending on where you want to go with it. But you were talking about the medical stuff as well, and I just want to say 70s medicine terrifies me. Every scene, I know they're made to be horrifying, but I was also hearing that the spinal tap was one of the scenes that was making people pass out and queasy. Like, apparently Friedkin himself said that was maybe even more so than the demons and everything. It was the spinal tap with the blood spurting and a lot of those scenes like that, and just the trauma of people having been to hospitals and things like that. But those loud bangings and everything, and the way that it's sort of a motif that carries over from the first of all, when we start talking about plot, we're going to have to talk about that first sort of section, the preamble to the story in Georgetown, because that in itself is sort of a masterclass of storytelling. There's not a lot of speaking going on. We're getting the setup of like the eyes are very important with the man who has like the one cloudy eye that they're all hammering away, and the way that like the hammering these loud noises tend to be like sort of Pazuzu related things, and then how that carries over to the medical side when she's in these machines and they're so loud and moving
MRI.
and right.
Yeah.
So a lot of that is amazing to me as well.
Well, that opening section in Iraq is very, the archaeology and all that. It's really interesting because it seems to be kind of grounding the origin for the emergence of the supernatural, right? And at the end of it, we see that classic shot of, Father Marin versus the giant dog statue with the phallic protrusions and
the dogs,
serpentine penis,
dogs fighting in the background and stuff, and
fighting, that's
pure chaos.
That was ripped off, I think, by John Carpenter for Mouths of Madness. There's like all sorts of things that are in this movie that are ripped off by other horror directors.
Oh,
but that's
totally.
a side note. I wanted to respond to your issue about the medical scene, because when I show that to students today, 18 to 24-year-old people, they freak out at that moment. It still has the power to scare people. More, people laugh nowadays at like the puking of pea soup. Like that whole moment is a classic from the film, that it surprises you when it happens, and it does disturb you in a way. But the kind of gritty medical realism, that scene really is horrifying, and it needs to be there. It really does. This film also, I remember reading about how it's the first appearance of Ritalin in the movies, which is the drug prescribed for hyperactivity and things like that. So that's kind of an interesting note of trivia.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and it's also, I think, presented as like science trying to find like butt in on something that really doesn't have any domain over. Right, and I thought it was also interesting how repeatedly a therapist is brought up. Like, she should use a therapist, and they keep going, no, no therapist. Before we do a therapist, we should do a spinal tap. Like, don't bring in anyone to talk to her. That's a waste of time. Let's get in there and do some invasive procedures first.
I was really interested in the way that sort of psychiatrists were portrayed at the time, because they're like, oh, we don't want to take her to a shrink, and when they do, it's immediate hypnosis, and it's sort of like
right.
hokey. It's not grounded. It's this sort of like stereotype of what you would think of like some very extreme psychiatrist of some kind. And I just thought that was like an interesting statement and like place to come into. And I don't know if that's where medicine was at the time, or if it was like a decision,
Well, obviously, medicine was more primitive 40 years ago, but I hate to use that word primitive because I grew up in that time. So it's not like we had medicine men, but that's what priests are in a way. They're the spiritual medicine men of today, right? So the film, and this is grounded in the book, of course, it sets out to procedurally eliminate every potential explanation for what's happening to the child other than possession. And having Father Karras be a priest who is also a psychologist at Georgetown University allows us to read the whole test to see whether the child is truly possessed by the church through a psychological lens. So it's like a psychological test. It's not therapy per se, but it's still psychology is kind of the last thing to go here before the movie just says, okay, everybody, this is all a cult. This is the only way we can understand Reagan's behavior is through satanic possession. And from that point forward, proven through technology, like the backmasked speech, the backwards talk, and all that, it's proven. And, a lot of people point to the special effects of this movie as being what makes it realistic and horrifying. But, yes, all the vapors in the air because they shot this in like a meat locker or something like that, right?
They brought like a refrigeration company to like hook up a bunch of refrigeration. It was like a kind of a set, and they just literally hooked it up to refrigeration, and they could only shoot in it for about an hour before the lights would get too hot and they wouldn't be able to see the breath anymore.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Interesting.
But yeah, that's an example of Friedkin torturing his actors and stuff, right?
I mean, to talk about the temperature, he was looking for below zero, but at times it was around negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit.
What? Wow. Yeah. I didn't know it was that cold.
Well, all those visual special effects, they're real. They're not CGI, so that adds a layer to it that we can kind of appreciate nowadays. And I personally long for that to return. But,
absolutely.
The movie's coming at you from every angle, so it's not just the visuals. Reagan's cursing and the backward speak and all the voiceovers of Pazuzu that are kind of like, when she's like that. I forgot the voice actress's name, Mercedes.
McCambridge. I have it written down here.
She is amazing.
I have a note about that. Yeah. She apparently she broke her sobriety, gargled raw eggs, and chain smoked to get the bronchial voice wheeze, gurgle, and wail. And she was even restrained during some of her recording sessions because, according to her, this kind of performance is only possible when you have no freedom. Which, shout out to her because those voice performances are pretty iconic for sure.
So she originally didn't want to be credited on the film because she wanted people to think it was really Reagan's voice. And then eventually came back around. It was like, it's so successful, it's so massive. And then she realized the popularity that she could have been, taking advantage of and getting more roles. So she eventually sued Warner Brothers actually for a credit in the film because, the original contract wasn't set up that way. But
interesting. Oh, I wanted to touch on the Iraq stuff. I felt like it added a sense of it widened the scale. It made it grander. It made it feel like we were watching an epic struggle between these immortal forces rather than a smaller story about a family, which it ultimately ends up being somewhat, but it's always sort of framed by this epic narrative, I think.
Well, it feels so much more dangerous because it is global, ancient, all of these things that are set up in that early
do you think that Jurassic Park was referencing this scene with the start because I kept thinking of them going and finding the amber and then that kind of linking dinosaurs to ancient demons, and I was like, was Spielberg referencing this movie? I don't know.
Maybe. Well, it's funny, Arnzen brought up the sort of, I always call them the bearded club. They're De Palma, your Scorsese's, all those guys in the 70s who were the new Hollywood guys, and they were all friends. I think for the most part, a lot of them were friends. A lot of them went to school together, studied in the same way, and they're all like I've spoken on the podcast before. They're all these students of filmmakers. They're the first generation of filmmakers who loved movies so much they studied them, they understood them, and knew how to break all the rules and create new, interesting ways of telling stories, as Friedkin did with sort of his documentary style that he brought into The French Connection, things like that. And even would influence this film as well, just the way that it's shot, and sometimes we're up close and gritty with some of the exorcism stuff that's going on, and it's effective. Another thing I wanted to mention with Iraq while we're there, and then we'll move through this plot a little bit. Friedkin talked a lot about how he wanted visually to tell the story of, good versus evil, and sort of blazing sun scenes where it's the brightest day, and we get multiple shots of the sun in the sky in Iraq, and also I think the first shot of the movie is in black and white. The sun is shown, and or at least it seems black and white. It seems like it was sort of,
and it transitions to color, right?
Right. It was trying to, just juxtapose that with the scenes in the attic and things like that, where it's very, very dark scenes at the end where the priests are battling against this demon, and sort of the struggle of light and good. And I think that's a motif that if you look throughout, he's looking for good versus evil sort of thing. But I think that's sort of a surface way to look at it too. I think it's also is he saying something about one, like either religion or science is good, is, you know, are these two at odds? Are the priests and demons, everything's at odds in this film, it feels like. And he wanted to show that through the cinematography, which I appreciate.
Yeah, and I would add that I think in that opening prologue, if you will, it's one of the reasons it feels so epic in scope is because it's shot more artistic, like a painting. Like you know, all the hammers chipping away. Often you see these people hammering. I don't think this is realistic at all. But when you look at the long shots that Friedkin's using, it almost looks like these are little demons that are picking away at at Marin's body. So it's very much like a hell painting. It reminds you of Bruegel or somebody like that, where it's just a depiction of what hell might look like. And you know, Father Marin is walking through this kind of, you know, he's being attacked at every angle, right? Remember one moment, the woman in a carriage kind of almost runs him over, and that's like almost an Omen moment, right? Isn't it?
He has guns pointed at him.
Pazuzu's influence is seen very early on in this story. Like you can look to things and maybe it's just a coincidence, things are going on, but very clearly, like everybody who looks at him potentially could be Pazuzu, you know, inhabiting them. Or we can start to look for people who are around Reagan or around Chris and start to try to see, like, is there some other influence that we can feel. Which kind of brings me to the tone of the story and the way I think some of the cuts that are in there. The film was edited in a way to make you feel uncomfortable. It was intended to, you know, have you feel the pressure of a demon who's going to eventually show up, obviously. But on top of that, it's also like jarring cuts and like cutting from a quiet scene to a loud scene and things like that really just put you. You might be like finally relaxing, and then you sort of get that jolt, and you're right back into it, and you know, the fear level stays pretty high the whole time.
I felt like it had a lot of like audio jump scares almost. Yet they work better than many of them that you see in other movies today, or throughout time, because it felt like very particular purposes. Like they were linking this like harsh sound to the demon, like you said, or to different scenes. And unfortunately, I feel like a lot of people saw this and said, I'm going to put a loud sound in my movie to freak out the audience and make them jump, without tying it necessarily like thematically and through the language of the film to particular subjects within the movie.
Well, yeah, you know, the sound in this film, it did deserve that Academy Award for this very reason. As well as the editing is great and probably deserved an award too. But the sound really is what makes this film so creepy. I think The Exorcist succeeds the way that all the best horror movies do, because it attempts to turn a movie theater space, the theatrical space of an actual movie theater, cinemaplex, into a kind of haunted space, right? It really takes advantage of the darkness and the surround sound, and it, you know, kind of just tortures the audience.
And we would be remiss to not mention Tubular Bells, one of the best horror tracks of all time, in my opinion, that when it came on early in the movie, it just delights me. Love that track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish there was more of that in the movie, actually, because, you know, people know the movie because of that song, but it only appears like once or twice. But there is this great lyrical moment where the wind is blowing through nuns' habits and things like that. It's really a great little moment.
Yeah, and I think you see kids wearing Halloween costumes, which immediately ties it forever to be a Halloween song, if it wasn't already going to be.
So I wanted to move into sort of the Georgetown stuff now, if we can. I wanted to start out by saying the transition for Regan, I think, is very effective, because when we see Regan, she is so innocent and she's so believable as this child who's just like, you know, she's so privileged to be in the situation she is with her mom, who is clearly rich and famous, and like she's asking for horses, and she's so excited to go, you know, she's going to take her to Europe and all of these things. And like, just to see the juxtaposition, we talked last week about how, you know, even with all her wealth and status and everything like that, she was put up against something that none of that mattered anymore. And to see sort of her desperation lead her all the way to faith, which she was an atheist. I don't know if it's expressly stated in the movie, but it definitely was in the book. She clearly was a non-believer.
She says she's an atheist in the movie too.
Okay, that's cool. So, but yeah, there's the transition from innocent Regan, who I totally buy as like this, young girl who has totally different priorities than Pazuzu the demon, who as soon as there's any sort of possession, it's so effective. And just to talk about the practical effects again, the makeup is amazing. The marks that she creates on her face with the cross later, it just, I mean, it's terrifying for a reason, and it's stuck with people for a long time. And then the eyes, I feel like eyes are a very effective way to start to tell stories, obviously. And just having the way that people, like, there's even the homeless man who is like asking for change, and the way that his eyes are so blue and piercing, and he looks at Father Karras, and just like it just continues to be a thing. And then we get the most horrifying eyes that I've ever seen, in these like yellow like veined eyes and everything.
Yeah, can you help an old altar boy? that moment, right?
Exactly.
I love that.
Right.
Oh man.
Well, and it shows Karras's character as well. Just like he can't. He's kind of disgusted, right? And he just leaves. He doesn't do the priestly thing.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised he didn't give the guy any money. But yeah, I think there's something else going on in that scene.
Right. Well, he's so tortured by the guilt about it, leaving his mother to pursue his life at Georgetown, and then ultimately abandoning her. It's like he has this abandonment anxiety that he's playing out through the whole film. And that's why Regan becomes his mother at the end, right? So it's like that's the plot progression for his character, and it's really, really interesting the way that he is kind of this. Not only he's becoming skeptical about the religion or about the church and the power it might have. Partially because he's a psychologist, but also partially because his mother is dying. He's losing his mother. There's a lot of Freudian stuff going on with his character that could explain his psychology in the movie. But Regan is so center stage, Pazuzu is so center stage, we don't really pay as much attention to that, I don't think. But he is an equally main character who he's possessed by guilt, and Regan is possessed by the devil. And these are parallel characters. This film is a parallel narrative, but everybody thinks it's just about Pazuzu in the child's body. That's not the case. This is a parallel narrative, and it is masterfully done.
I wanted to talk about when he loses his mother, and he's clearly going through a lot. There is the moment where the phone rings, and he has that extreme reaction to it. Do you know what I'm talking about? The first time the phone rings, and he's by himself, that was a shotgun blast moment. Friedkin off screen, or someone off screen had been told to like fire a shotgun, and apparently the actor was not
literally a shotgun blast.
Literally a shotgun blast. The actor was not happy about that. Said that he's an actor, he doesn't need outside stimulation and all this sort of stuff. And like those are stories that go to the legend of the film, and I will say, with everything everybody said in the documentary that I watched about how Friedkin was quite a tyrant, they all also respected him for his artistic vision and saw him for the genius that he was. But it's so funny to me to think of like a situation where you're just like firing guns on a closed set because you're so powerful. This
reminds me of some of the stories we hear about Kubrick and some of the ones we've tackled with him. So it seems to be of a time with certain kinds of directors.
Yeah, and like, say what you will, it was effective. I wouldn't do it, but he did, and it's lent to the legacy. You mentioned Stanley Kubrick. I did find an interesting little tidbit. I don't know how valid it is, but Stanley Kubrick apparently wanted to direct this film, but only if he could produce it himself, as the studio was worried that he would go over budget and over schedule. It eventually settled on Mark Rydell, but William Peter Blatty insisted on William Friedkin instead. After a standoff with the studio, which initially refused to budge over Rydell, Blatty eventually got his way. Little Kubrick connection.
I always think of the character Burt Dennings in the movie. Like, there's a lot of what you would say a meta cinema going on here, with a movie director is actually in the movie. So what is that character doing, and how does it reflect on William Friedkin? Is it supposed to embody some of his kind of characteristics, or is he kind of making fun of what film directors are. Or what is he
Right.
doing with that?
I love to see that. Like anytime that they can get really meta with it, especially in a film, we're in a very meta time and we have been for a while now, but in the 70s it wasn't as popular. And to get those moments, I love to see writers get to write about writers or filmmakers get to film something about filmmakers, because it is, it usually is like some over the top version of what goes on set and how people are. Yeah, I think it's clear that Dennings is like an artist who also, seems like he has the power to do whatever he wants. And maybe he was making some commentary about that, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. And then he's murdered by the devil. So
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know what that means.
I mean, just like medicine is kind of pushed aside as not being able to explain the inexplicable haunting and possession, so too are like the fantasies of Hollywood are kind of tossed aside and shown. We get to see backstage what movie making really is in a movie, right? So like they show that whole Georgetown scene where it's how we're introduced to Chris MacNeil through Father Karras, who's watching her act in this weird student rebellion movie that's being shot. Remember that? And there's
I was confused by that scene. I thought it was like a real protest for a bit, but then I'm like, wait, I think this is supposed to be a movie.
It is, yeah. I was really confused as to like what point are we making here? Because it was, the protesters were blocking schools, and there was something being said about how like, you have to let the students into schools so that we can, end this conflict. But at the same time, like people protest for a reason. Like things are going on. Things that like things need to be shaken up sometimes, and people need need to be made aware of things.
Impossible not to think about that when we're living in a time in which we're seeing protests all over the country. So I was definitely colored by the moment we're in, for sure, when I saw it.
Well, and in a lot of ways, we're exactly where we were 40 years ago because, there was the whole student youth movement of the late 60s was still fresh on everybody's mind in 1973, especially those who had to be old enough to go to the theater. My dad, not me, to actually see it, right? So, somebody over the age of 18 would have lived through the whole student, movement of the 60s, where protest was a part of everyday life, the civil rights movement and all that. So I think the film was like representing that, but through a kind of echo, a cinematic historical echo. And what's really interesting to me is that, we see Father Karras walk away from what he's watching while Chris MacNeil is screaming dialogue, and she says, point blank, you have to work within the system if you want to change anything. Like she's shouting this through a megaphone at the student rebels, right? But really, that's a shout at Karras, who's rejecting the system of Christianity at that point in his life. He's kind of thinking about walking away from the system. And so the whole movie becomes, if we're following his plot arc, his narrative arc, not Reagan's or Chris's, is that he has to come to accept the system that and to work within it successfusly. And that's what happens where at the end of the movie he's like, take me, the whole classic climax of this movie is where he's kind of given himself over to the martyrdom of being a priest. So he has worked within the system successfully. That's the plot arc of Father Karras.
I really like that. I've never thought of it in that context before.
So I want to touch on another take that I had from last week that I felt like really solidified watching this movie this week. And that was the idea that the demon is being strongly related to women's sexuality throughout, really, because if you look at Reagan, like she is right at the cusp of puberty. You have like everything related to like homoeroticism, like the lick me scene, the kind of things that Reagan says to the priests that are very sort of homoerotic. There's a lot of just like quote unquote non-traditional sexual orientations being sort of cast in the light of being satanic or impure. And I think it's also notable that the women characters have to be rescued by the men, and you can see the priest is sort of having an authority over a woman's body in those scenes, and then having to cast out the impurities. And then I think you can even take it to another level of he takes the impurities into himself, and in so doing ends up dying from it. Yet he saves the woman and Reagan here. We also have Chris McNeil sort of be relegated as a damsel who has to be rescued by these priests. So I just couldn't, like, I had these thoughts when I was reading the book, but they really solidified for me watching the movie that it seems like you could see this totally as a story about, like, the patriarchy, and how it sort of holds it up. Like, I would say the movie's in support of it, which is one of the reasons, again, why I feel like I'm a little bit conflicted about this movie.
Oh, I have a lot to say about that, because this is an issue that we discuss a lot in my literature classes where I show students this film, try to get them to think critically about a horror movie that's out to just spook them, and I've actually published an article on this as well in a book called Studies in the Horror Film, The Exorcist, which everybody should go out and read if you can find it.
I'll link some of this stuff. If you want to send me some links, I'll put them in the show notes. So
yeah, it was published by Centipede Press maybe 5-6 years ago. It's a great study of this film from many different angles. I mean, even and other authors are in it, like Thomas Ligotti. Blatty has some things in there, so it's really cool.
Oh, cool.
But in my article, I talk about this as family ideology. That is, it isn't just focused on gender politics in terms of like women or men, like toxic masculinity versus, femininity, female power, or whatever it might be, but about how the whole family dynamic is problematic because it is patriarchal, as you said, Luke. I mean, think about this. They're fathers, they're priests. We call them fathers, right? And Chris McNeil is going through a divorce or recently divorced. So the priest becomes a substitute father figure, quite literally, stepping into this family and expunging out how the impure divorcee life, that influence that it might have on the child. That's really what we're seeing here, is a story about how single motherhood opens up the window to allow demonic possession, and how a father figure needs to be there, even if it isn't a father necessarily, or a husband per se. It's really interesting that Burt Jennings is kind of Chris McNeil's love interest in a way, it's intimated, right? And then he gets killed and expelled and all this other stuff because he's kind of a corrupt father figure. He's one of these, artistic drunkard. He has all sorts of. He's
probably
problems.
an atheist too.
But exactly.
The way that Reagan confronts the mother about marrying him as well is a whole thing. Like, just seeing the fact that he could become a father figure, like, does she love him, and all of that, ties into that as well.
That's a real touching moment where, Linda Blair seems very innocent and pure, but interested and curious. She's in a preteen kind of thing. And, a lot of those early scenes with her are just meant to establish that she's innocent. And she isn't just a teenage girl acting up. She's an innocent victim of demonic forces. But really, anytime a movie is asking you not to think about something, it's really wants to go there and make you think about it on a subconscious level. So obviously, a kind of a quick, easy analysis of this film would say she represents kind of the rebellious youth, right? And perhaps the uppity woman that feminists were often castigated as being in the 70s. Like, a woman shouldn't make a spectacle out of herself. Well, that's all that Reagan does, is make a spectacle out of herself. A good girl shouldn't talk like that. And that's all she does, is talk like that. So, yeah, she represents the kind of upsurge resistance voice of feminism in the 70s. But at the same time, it's kind of put in its place by these priests. The whole patriarchal notion of it is kind of pushed aside and said, well, this is, religion, this is God's will, and other things like that. And so it becomes a substitute for the basic bare-boned gender politics of this.
What is that? Yeah. What does that represent for her actually killing Dennings as well? You know what I mean? What does that represent in terms of, like, her putting down a patriarchal figure in some way?
Well, I think it's Pazuzu doing it, trying to usurp it and trying to maybe take that position, like, let Satan be your daddy. But I wanted to get back on what you just said, Mike, about how it sort of conflates religion with fatherhood and with the patriarchy, and how that is such a important topic in America, right? Like, you see this everywhere, how the patriarchy, one of the reasons it is so entrenched is it is almost given like a sort of spiritual power. Like that's the way it's supposed to be. Look at the Father, God is a man. You know what I mean? Like it is all ingrained and really goes hand in hand with the idea of Christianity and at least this perspective on Christianity. So yeah, I mean, it's again one of the reasons why I bump up against this movie, sort of politically. Yet I can still appreciate it. It's also just fascinating that it is talking about all these subjects, even though on the surface it's not. It's just a book, or, a movie about possession. That's all it seems to be.
It's almost a miracle for a movie with this much sort of like underlying analogies going on for it to be as popular as it is. This I think adjusted for inflation, this is not only the highest grossing horror film of all time, but also the highest grossing film from Warner Brothers of all time.
Wow.
So like that was massively popular. It was absolutely like a cultural phenomenon. And then I love just sneaking in subliminal messages, like having people think about it on repeat viewings. Like it just adds so much to a film like this.
Yeah. In the version you've never seen and all the restored versions, there have been like CGI editions of Pazuzu's face flashing on the oven and things like that. Like
not a fan of those. I saw those in my version.
Yeah.
They didn't look very good in my opinion.
Well, those were supposed to be what people in the 70s said were subliminal messages, like they saw them in the shadows and things like that. And then Friedkin, or, I think with Blatty's urging, tried to make it literal, like, and to make it real, when really it wasn't real. It was just people saw it and interpreted it. I think some of those subliminal messages, though, the popularity of it, the way that we talk about it is this folklore surrounding the movie. Again, it serves to distract us from what is a subtle message, which are these ideological value systems that are playing out on the screen, like gender politics and things like that. So those are subtle too. They're not necessarily subliminal, but they're subtextual. For our culture, for pop culture to kind of celebrate the subliminal is a distraction from the subtextual.
I like that, yeah.
Well, and there is kind of some troubling linkage between that and sexuality too, right? Like, especially when you look at some of the scandals surrounding the Catholic Church and abuses of altar boys and so forth. And then you have, even at the end of the film, Reagan goes up to the priest and gives him a kiss on the cheek to thank him for what he's done. And I don't know. I don't know what's trying to be said with that. But then, obviously, fuck me, Christ, and using the crucifix. It's like they're directly making this link between sexuality and religion.
Well, I think all Christian horror stories and films have a conservative impulse where they kind of destroy everything through sin and chaos and ugliness, only to put it back together. And really the endings of horror films are where it makes its political stance. So like if the social order is put back together and they live happily ever after, then it's probably a very conservative kind of politic that's saying like, trust religion, don't question it. Or, if it's an open-ended thing, like maybe the movie The Thing, then it's it's a little more, it's asking the audience to keep thinking about these issues and maybe not to settle on what the scripts that have been handed to us by our culture and society.
Which is why I think Friedkin and Blatty disagreed about the ending, right? I think both were in a different camp. I think, the ambiguity is there in some ways. I guess ultimately good wins out in this story. But
do you want to explain that? Because I didn't hear about their disagreement. So did you find out like what they wanted?
Yeah, so basically Blatty was looking for more closure, similar to how there's a conversation at the end of the novel where there's two priests who are talking and they're kind of remembering the sacrifices.
Oh,
and
it's
there's
the priest
whole
and the
Casablanca,
cop, I think, right?
Right, the Casablanca moment, everything. There's sort of the closure that happens there. And like they're remembering the dead and all of this. Whereas like, the moment of remembrance we really get in the film is just the medallion being handed to the priest, and that's sort of the only memory that we get. But apparently, this is the only scene that I watched the spider walk scene, but in your version, how did it end, Luke? Because I believe there's like a conversation between one of the priests at the end, right? Or
yeah, the priest talks to the cop again, much like the book, and they walk away together talking about movies.
Okay. Well, I think there is in the theatrical as well.
It's long.
There's also a moment where the priest walks over and he looks at the stairs So that felt like a remembrance moment for me, where he chooses not to walk down them. It felt like that was kind of like that meant something. He turns away and decides to walk a different direction.
I think, like Arnzen was saying, with Blatty, over time, Blatty kind of convinced Friedkin to add in some of this extra material, and I think that ending is extended in order to like sort of give even more remembrance and give even more of like a neat closure to it, which to get back to the analogy of sort of like the more conservative status quo situation, I think the nicer that the ending is, its potential for it to be sort of seen as more the status quo, whereas if it leaves you completely devastated in a way, or sort of like you don't know what has happened and the status quo has been thrown out the window. Not to say that that's what happened here, but we saw 2 people die in order to save this girl, and I think just like having things be more implied, like of course everybody will mourn their death and everything like that, but Blatty wanted to really show it and have audiences walk out saying like, okay, so there was a reason for it, instead of having it sort of be more implied.
I mean, I think the ending is just as puzzling as the beginning in a way, because it feels unfinished to me, and I'm never really sure like what is with that token that he hands her. At one point in the film, Kinderman finds the statue head that is a callback to the opening scene in Iraq, but I don't know how that statue head got there. I mean, there's so much of a disconnect.
I thought that was
that
supposed to be a ceramic figure that Reagan had made, because he later asks if she's the artist, I think you see some figurines sitting on the counter, but I don't think that's super clear. So I that was just my guess, because I had that same question of like, how the hell did that get there?
That's what I assumed, that it was the totem or whatever from Iraq. Yeah, I didn't even make the connection with the ceramics.
Well, I mean, that's the question.
It looks like maybe she made a somewhat of a Pazuzu herself out of a ceramic figurine.
That makes sense. Yeah,
that's possible. I mean, it really doesn't tell us 100% or make it crystal clear how Pazuzu even got to this place.
Right.
And I mean, later on in my life, I did a little research on the demon Pazuzu, not a lot, but I saw he was a demon of the wind and was carried on the wind. So often in the movie, you see that open window for her bedroom. And at the end of the movie, it's closed up and boarded up. So maybe he just came in on the wind and landed in her spirit.
Came in through the Ouija board.
Well,
Luke and I spoke about inciting incidents with the whole demon situation. And it's still kind of puzzling as to what specifically draws Pazuzu to this family. And Luke mentioned kind of in jest, like the idea that like, oh, this single mother who has gone through a divorce and is like focusing on her career and all this stuff. But there really is. Usually I would consider. I would think that there would be an inciting incident. Maybe the Ouija board is sort of our gateway.
Well, we do also see a desecration takes place. It's given a lot more weight in the book than we get here, but we see one moment of like a statue that's been desecrated.
I'm usually not a fan. There are horror movies that are sort of schlocky for a reason, and they are. But I'm usually bummed out when I ask somebody to watch a horror film and they're like, "Oh, I just laughed the whole time through." But I laughed out loud when I saw that desecration. Like it was very funny to me, and like that's really I was scared for a lot of the movie. I felt like the tension and everything, but God, that moment really just broke the tension for me a little bit.
Well, yeah, a lot of the religious iconography in the movie, it might be more disturbing for certain audiences that go to church every Sunday and so forth. I know you guys already talked about that, but the film itself is kind of constantly drawing from Christian relics and symbols and all sorts of things that just kind of echo in a subtle way the spiritual realm as it's manifest in material world, and Catholicism is founded in something related to transubstantiation, which is like the spirit rises from above the body and all this other stuff. And I don't know. It's being very serious about the religious motifs, I guess is my point. That for it they know how campy this idea is, and so everything they're doing is an attempt to kind of ground it in the occult and in religion, so that people will take it seriously, I guess.
Right. You do have to take it seriously. Like you see Marin later when he gets vomit on his, what is that, the stole that he's wearing, the purple cloth, he has to go and wash it in the sink and get it cleansed, and then he comes back in ready to do battle again. So they're sort of lent this weight of almost like their armor or weapons to be used against the devil.
They are like superheroes in that whole "the power of Christ compels you" moment. And the way I look at that scene though is fathers yelling at their daughters. It's like all done. It's all done through voice. It's all done through yelling and words. And it's a battle of words when she's cursing and saying obscenities and imitating the voice of Karras's mother. All that stuff. Everything Reagan's doing, more of it's done through her voice and the words that are profane than anything else. And this comes across in the novel as well, I think, pretty clearly. So it's really this battle between offensive language and pure language, right? And, on her body, there's a battle going on between purity and innocence versus corruption, sexuality, violation of the body, wounds and penetration and all that stuff. And that invites that kind of female sexuality read that Luke referenced earlier. But the religious side of this is really like the power of words and like the law of the Father versus the power of the body or something like that. There's something weird going on with that.
Yeah, it's a war taking place and the battlefield is literally a woman's body. So I think that is kind of pertinent to today, right?
And I think about how, like, when the shirt's pulled up and the "help me" shows up on her stomach and things like that, like the cry for help and like I don't know, just being sort of not able to be in possession and in control of your own body as a female. You know what I mean?
Well, and there's a little bit of that, like, oh, it's icky that stuff comes out of a woman's body, right? Kind of like turned up to 11 with all the just different projections and blood and everything and pea soup that is coming out of Reagan throughout. It seems like it's referencing sort of real world hang-ups people have.
Right. There's a couple of things that you're making me think of right now. One that I wanted to mention, I wanted to get back into the practical effects just to talk about sort of like the bed levitation and the moving of the dresser and a lot of those things and how they look so real. The room itself, the set was kind of built up on 8 pneumatic wheels that would create like earthquake effects and things like that. And then they would also build in, like, the bed was built into the weight, and there was like a mechanism in the wall that allowed the grips and a bunch of crew members to sort of like move it around and have it float and things like that. So all the mechanism was like towards the back. And just as you said earlier, Arnzen, that sort of ingenuity and engineering, like to see that in a film and to see sort of different industries come together to get things like that made, it just adds so much to a film like this. And then the other thing I wanted to do was just give shout outs to some of the actors because like we mentioned Marin and Max von Sydow as Marin is like he's even wearing prosthetic makeup to make him look a little older for 1970. Okay. How old he was in 1973. But like he's just an absolute legend. Like the gravitas that he brings to the role. We talked about how he is a superhero, and like when he is sort of brought up in the book last week, we talked about how it's a shift. We're like, oh, we know that this is the guy to beat a demon. He's the holy man who's been a holy man for his whole life, and if anybody can do it, he can. And I just thought like that's amazing casting. Like the Seventh Seal. He's been in so many things that make him this legend, and he recently passed away, so R.I.P. to him.
R.I.P.
And Ellen Burstin we have to talk about because I feel like what she's given to do, I think she does a lot with, especially like you think of like your scream queens and you think of like how like women screaming and being afraid of things in horror movies and things like that like was a thing, but there's a lot more depth to her character than something like that. So I want to give credit to that role and that performance there. You can see her struggling with religion, struggling with like being a parent and going through divorce, focusing on career, that sort of thing. I would have liked to have gotten just the line of her speaking about how like she was trying to go direct something, because I thought that was really an actor taking a step to be maybe even more than that and sort of pursue something that's entirely artistically their own is a huge career step and things like that. So I felt that was something that I liked from the novel that didn't make it into the movie.
Yeah, I mean, Ellen Burstin is amazing, and the treatment of her character over the course of the story is just denigrates her. She's barely a walking corpse by the end there. She's at the end of her rope, both physically, and she acts so well to kind of sell this idea that the loss of her child is the loss of everything to her, and she's desperate to save her child and all this other stuff, right? And it's a great kind of counterpoint to Father Karras. And I mean, all the characters seem to be suffering for a lot for their sins, and Pazuzu is exploiting their various kind of weaknesses, right? Not just because he gets off on evil, but maybe it's intimated that people, and this comes across because of the Catholicism of it all. If you commit sin, you deserve the punishment. You have to kind of grapple with that. You have to earn the last rites that Karras gets at the end, where he kind of gets that last blessing. You've become the devil in the end, but you saved a child and you did something for somebody other than yourself, so you deserve to go to heaven as a hero. And maybe Chris McNeil earns something too, right? Like she accepts religion in her life. She's no longer a skeptic, so therefore she's earned kind of the right to have her child back.
Well, and maybe that's why he gives back the medallion. Like, if that represents religion to her, like, you keep it, you're going to need this going forward.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, and I wanted to shout out Linda Blair, too. Just, we mentioned her before, but, like, so much of this movie goes through that performance.
Oh, yeah.
And to be so young and to have it be so centered on what you're doing. I mean, I know she is not doing the voice, but she's still doing the physicality and everything else going, I'm sure that there must be stuff about behind the scenes with Linda Blair, right, James?
She was one of the ones I was speaking about that was injured. There was sort of when she's flailing forward and backward on the bed at that point when the doctor.
I know what scene you're talking about too. Yeah.
She there was like basically something that was molded to her back. She was strapped in with like something lace on the side, like some laces basically going up, and then you couldn't see it on the front. And they were in the back basically like pumping like some sort of pneumatic like hinge or something like that, just flailing her back and forth. So it wasn't her doing that. It was like she was being controlled. And then the lace started coming off the side, and so she was like, rather than it being in line with her back the entire time, it started to separate, and every time it would go back, it would slam into her back over and over. And in the scene, her line is like, stop, all this stuff. And apparently the scene where she was actually getting hurt made the cut. It's crazy to think of a child in a scenario like that. There's also another one where Ellen Burstin is she's smacked by the demon and she flies back, and there's like a stunt person who was pushing her, and she was like pushed very hard and like hit her head and like hurt her back and stuff. She ended up being okay, like went to a chiropractor, but that's what I mean, like very physical movie. Like the directors, everybody's willing to go there and like risk the safety of the actors in some cases. And again, maybe those are stories that are played up to think about how extreme the story was and that kind of thing. But the actors themselves are telling these stories, so you got to take it from the source.
Well, their performances really deliver it in a human way and make it kind of, again, believable. It encourages us to kind of forget our skeptical mind and take that hat off and just accept it for what it is, because these people seem very real and genuine, and that the experience is genuine, right?
Right. And I don't think Friedkin is trying to be like abusive to actors. I think that he really felt that like that was what it took to get these actors into these headspaces in a similar way to like Kubrick.
Yeah. It probably also shows why we need unions to protect people from directors, because this can lead to serious injury and or death. As we saw with like the Twilight Zone movie, when directors start overstepping bounds. There has to be limits to these sort of things,
right? Especially where kids are concerned, for sure.
I was thinking about how we said that medicine was primitive in the 70s. Well, maybe movie making in the studios was also kind of primitive before there were certain laws in place and union protections and so forth.
Right.
But narratively speaking, Reagan is the one character who, I mean, in a way, she is innocent. She hasn't committed any sin except maybe believing in the Ouija boards rather than reading a Bible, right? So, like, all the characters in the movie sell and make their guilt and their feelings about the afterlife and their worries and fears realistic, whereas she's just almost an object, right? Like an innocent lamb that's been taken over by Pazuzu.
That we talked in the book episode about the loss of innocence and like what that represented there, and it's just like it is made all the more real because it's not somebody who deserves all of this, right? It's someone who unfortunately this was put upon, and it's like, in what did this person do to, you know, incur all of this? We're not really, you know, we're not fully sure, because the inciting incident,
if they implied
clear.
that she was in any way and welcomed this in, then I think it would complicate our you know, who we're rooting for, right?
Exactly.
Right? She needs to just be purely innocent for this to work.
Well, and also for the Catholic Church to be absolved of their sin of being patriarchal, because at the very end of the movie, when Linda Blair directly looks Dyer in the eyes and almost like forgives him, and I think she accepts and kisses his collar, if I remember right.
Yep.
And like there's this,
she looks at his collar particularly and then kisses him on the cheek.
and that scene does so much because it proves that Pazuzu's gone now, right? In a way, because like her lips don't sizzle and boil off,
right?
Like they would with
I thought
holy
it also
water.
showed that maybe she remembers more than she was letting on. Like maybe she does remember that the priest saved her in some way.
Yeah, but it's all symbolic, right? It's all symbolic. So it's an acceptance of the symbolism of the church.
You're making me think about one of my favorite scenes in both book and movie, and that's the scene where the holy water is thrown on her, and it's not holy water, and the reaction and the complication that comes from that. I just think that tends to be one of my favorite scenes, because it's that moment of, especially in the book, we're led to be skeptics a lot longer in the book. We're allowed to sort of think until the very end that it could all just be in her head, and then. Even here, we're, you know, in the movie, we're seeing the holy water thrown on her that's not really holy water, and the reaction. So it's Pazuzu fucking with Karras, basically.
Yeah,
is what I get
so,
out
yeah.
of it. Yeah.
There's a lot of play too with just like, I think reading that book in the 70s, it was a bestseller before the movie came out. I mean, I remember seeing it on my uncle's shelf and wondering about, what is this best-selling book? It's one of the things that kind of attracted me to the horror genre as a writer.
That original cover is horrifying as well. I was looking online at the original cover, and I'm like, oh my God, it's so, and you don't really know what you're looking at. And it's so, it kind of hurts you to look at it.
Yeah, and the experience of reading it for the first time, imagine doing that without knowing anything about The Exorcist. Like, nowadays, it's so saturated in pop culture. People know The Exorcist through The Simpsons or something, you know? Every Halloween, there's a way to know The Exorcist growing up in America today that in 1970s, I mean, that didn't exist, right? So imagine the book being your first exposure to all this. I think turning the pages, it would be an experience of, my God, how far is this writer going to push the characterization of this child doing these things?
Yeah. And what is your take on that? Like, where does The Exorcist sit as sort of one of the best or greatest horror films of all time, one of the scariest books ever written, as is claimed on the cover? Do you think it lives up to that, or is that all sort of just part of the marketing ploy, or is it truly that in American cinema?
Is it the most terrifying novel ever written? No, I think the book actually, I don't know, in my mind, the book has lesser power compared to the film. I feel like the book is manipulating obscenity and things that almost in a way to just kind of push the boundaries under the aura of having a religious purpose or something. And it's also kind of responding to the cultural interest in, Satan and things like that, possession of its time, right? As you guys all know, as most people know, Blatty was responding to a news report about a child being possessed and exorcised. And so there's like this true crime element to the story. And true crime storytelling was actually, a thing that became very popular in the early 70s, right? So it's kind of a victim of its genre in that way. Everybody thinks of it as a horror story, but you could put it in all sorts of different boxes, right? You could call it a true crime story or an occult thriller or even a domestic melodrama. Really, it's a soap opera about a single mother who can't control her child, that kind of thing, right?
When you back it with the filmmaking pedigree as well, like you're talking about elevating material to one, like we've spoken about, sort of like adding in these other allegories, but revolutionizing a genre is something that people talk about a lot with this movie, and like, you know, I'm not super well versed on you know, horror novels before The Exorcist, but I'm assuming it wasn't quite as revolutionary to storytelling in novels as, you know, The Exorcist is to horror today in movies and in cinema in general. And it's just, I think approaching it as a serious filmmaker and like, you know, it being nominated, it was massive for horror in general, and exposing really the whole population to horror.
Well, okay, let me speak on this just briefly. It is a blockbuster for many cultural reasons beyond just its greatness as a movie. Like, it's a very good movie. It's like, it might as well be the Godfather of horror. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like, it's a classic, canonical, excellent film it's just so well done. To me, it's the top movie, okay? But, you know, it popularized stories that were actually already being written in the subculture. So like in the late 60s, there were a lot of satanic thrillers that weren't as popular as Blatty's book. Like, Blatty's book was part of a larger trend. I was trying to say this before with true crime. You know, there were a lot of kind of satanic stories, occult thrillers that were coming out. And Rosemary's Baby is another one that came out before The Exorcist shortly, and was also an example of this genre kind of becoming very popular.
And that's another film, another horror film for sure, that's breaking convention. For absolutely, like that's like setting a trend of what, you know, future horror filmmakers would look to, and like sort of cater their horror to kind of, like you said, those are kind of some of the pinnacles that people look to and say like, oh, I want to make horror film now, and how can I make this a love letter to The Exorcist or Rosemary's Baby or something like that.
Yeah, nowadays it's all harkening back to these kind of iconic originals. But even though I'm saying or suggesting that Blatty and Friedkin are working in a genre that often is dismissed or not known about, by the same token, they're just products of their culture too. So like youth culture was questioning religion. Okay, they were questioning father figures having the answers to the problems in life when, like, you know, but people were coming home, their friends were coming home in body bags. How does God explain that, right? We've reached the moon, so we've broken into the heavens and there's nothing there but empty space. How does God explain that? So like the youth culture of the 60s that was growing up in the 70s were very skeptical of authorities, and not just the president, like Nixon, but also religious kind of authorities. As represented in this film. And so there's a conservative move in this movie to kind of suggest that, you know, the power of Christ can have the power that over
it's
things.
Like fighting back against all of that, right?
Yeah.
We also have like Black Sabbath becoming popular at the time, which I kept thinking of with the Black Mass and everything, right? Like, you got music is starting to embrace darker themes and stuff, which probably scared the hell out of everybody's parents.
Yeah. I mean, and it continued all the way out until the 80s, where, like, you know, Judas Priest and Motley Crue and these bands were being, you know, banned for having satanic messages. Led Zeppelin, you play it backwards, you hear something, right?
Yeah.
So like this stuff is all part of where horror entered the popular culture and became a kind of popular alternative way of looking at the world and kind of addressing the problems of our world and of our culture. And that's what horror has always done. It's kind of given an alternative, like horror stories are given license to explore the unknown, to attempt to account for narrative, to use narratives and stories to explain things that are inexplicable by the powers that be. That's why it's a great genre, and to track how it's changed over the years is always an interesting thing to do, because it's always responding to its society, but it's also a product of its time too.
And it sounds like you're saying that with the adaptation here, as we talk about adaptations on this podcast, it seems to me that this book, while a bestseller and important, was really it really solidified its place in pop culture as a story through its adaptation, which I think is fascinating, right? In the way that adaptation can work in genre, and not only just widening the audience, but being reinterpreted by another artistic mind, like the filmmaker, and creating like a synthesis. You talk about his style brought to Blatty's material, created the synthesis for this kind of film. I don't know. It's just fascinating to think about, like, the way adaptations can affect a story and make it have a lasting footprint that maybe it wouldn't have had otherwise.
I also wonder and am fascinated by sort of what you're saying. If I'm understanding correctly, is like this idea that, you know, because they're a product of the time, these are the ones that like sort of found the thing that would make it broadly appealing, found the thing that would allow them to be the sort of pinnacle of these stories, in like sort of the general audience's mind. Like there are other, like maybe it shouldn't necessarily be seen as the greatest, because it can be seen as the greatest, but it's not necessarily the first. It's kind of continuing a trend and then kind of striking while the iron's hot.
Yeah, I mean, this is true of a lot of genre texts, that there's always something happening. People are telling stories, but there's somebody does it perfectly in a way that encapsulates like the essence of the story. And this happens in all genres, and then classics are born, right? Texts that bear repeated viewing or study over the years and coming back to time and time again. So that's why there is a 40th version just out on Blu-ray a couple of years ago, right? It just keeps coming back because it's a mythical story. It has the power of myth. You know, it's got something archetypal about it that speaks to man across different time periods.
It's so funny because this reminds me of just being in the writing popular fiction program at Seton Hill. We would talk about these sorts of things and trying to write popular fiction, and how just it's almost impossible to predict. It is impossible to predict like what's going to hit and what's going to become massive when you can look at it and say, this is very much like these other 6 books that were written the same year, but for some reason this is the one, and you can try and figure out what it is. You know, people have talked about Harry Potter that way. You know, it was like, it wasn't particularly unique in any one way, but it did enough unique things, or it did enough familiar things, and it combined it in a certain way that just happened to hit everybody to where it became this, you know, super massive story. And it's just weird how that happens. But it's something that is definitely a phenomenon that has shaped sort of pop culture.
Yeah, and I think the power of this text really harkens to something maybe that James had brought up earlier about the different artistic visions between Blatty and Friedkin, and that somehow there's a tension here where the movie doesn't purport to give you all the answers, and it leaves a lot of gaps for interpretation. It kind of, you know, it even audaciously suggests things like in the spider walk sequence that are unbelievable, or the help me, like what are we supposed to believe, that Reagan is a little like small body inside her own body, and that's how her soul can scratch that out? It's like it enters the realm of symbolism, right? So something about the way that conflicts can't come to terms, they can't be resolved except through symbols, I think is part of it. And I think that can also explain why a lot of great books, like Luke was saying, a lot of classics, like, you know, why is Game of Thrones sort of canon now? Why is it a classic of dark fantasy? And maybe there's something about conflict in there that makes it so. Not necessarily, you know, doing something perfectly, but actually kind of embodying something problematic in a way that other people aren't doing. Like, I think sometimes conflict in the artist's mind produces greatness, not having all the answers, not being perfect, you know, being problematic. Something to think about.
So I think we're getting towards the point where we're going to take our vote. This is something we've been doing this year. At the end of episodes, or at the end of projects, we vote on whether or not the book or the film was better. I do want to give an opportunity to go around and touch on any final scenes we want to talk about. Before we get to that, I have one in particular I want to touch on, and that is the moment where Reagan kind of stands up in the bed and is sort of bound by the like aura of Pazuzu, who appears in statue form in the bedroom. And I feel like I've seen this scene elsewhere. It felt like she was also sexualized in a way. It looked like her nightgown was sort of see-through. I don't know. It felt like they were trying to say something with this moment that is seen. And again, I see sort of the intersection of women's sexuality and being associated with Satan. But I just thought it was a really, you know, interesting moment, and it had been so grounded in so many other moments, and yet here we have a statue appearing in the bedroom, right?
Well, that's a classic kind of iconography of the film. I mean, to me, that moment stands out as much as like what we see in the poster with the light beam coming out of the window as Father Merrin approaches the household. I mean, that to me, that's like the establishing good versus evil and all this other. But in the moment you're talking about, Luke, I mean, I always just read that straightforward as like that is Pazuzu kind of suffering in hell and being put back, doesn't want to go back to hell, but is being sent back to hell, and that's what that's supposed to represent. But it is a very ghost-like, it almost looks like it could have been shot in a cemetery, right? Like an old-fashioned horror movie imagery that we're getting there, and it's really pretty neat. It's done with silhouettes and shadows. I don't know how sexualized it is necessarily, but I thought that was pretty kind of a cool observation you made about the billowing dress and whatnot. How she's up on her knees, kind of crying out. Like maybe that's sexualizing, but I always read it as more animalistic. Pazuzu is a very animal-like demon. There's a lot of grunting and puking and spitting, and she renders this once the spirit is gone, only the animal body is left. And I think this is a religious concept too. And the priests have a little chat about this in the hallway and the stairs, where they're talking about what is the demon trying to do here? Why does it do this to us? And it comes back to the kind of being an animal versus being a civilized man or woman. And obviously, there's an argument being made here that religion civilizes you.
Okay. Any additional scenes you guys want to talk about before we get to the vote?
The last scene I love to talk about is the silhouetted sort of getting out of the taxi, looking up to the window moment.
Yeah.
Because it is so iconic, and I think that it's so effective as a poster. Luke and I were speaking in the book episode about how it was included in the book. I don't know if you remember this off the top of your head, but do you know if that was an original Blatty idea or if it was an original Friedkin idea? Because from the documentary I was watching, it seemed like Friedkin was speaking a lot about how they sort of conceived the shot and the idea behind it. So do you know if it was like added back in, and like, because we read a newer edition where Blatty had made some changes.
Of the book, yeah. It looked like he maybe had added some stuff.
Well, I mean, I think it's purely Friedkin's visuals that really make it remarkable to begin with, right? And so, like, there's a lot of cross-cutting that happens there as Marin's in the taxi cab approaching the house. It cuts, you see the eyes come out over the screen.
When the doors open and he's in full shadow and then steps through the threshold and is revealed and everything like that.
Yeah, well, and Reagan is reacting to him arriving. Like, she opens her eyes in bed and, like, knows he's there. You can tell. Or right. Pazuzu is. But, yeah, and then also the light is coming out of the window. It's almost brighter than the street lamp he's standing under, which I think is kind of saying something about, like, the projection of power.
Holy battle that's going to go down for sure. Like, there's something biblical about what's about to happen.
Yeah, it's a biblical setup of the conflict between good and evil and demon and priest. But the lighting of that scene is so interestingly done, and the cross-cutting, all of it, that, I mean, it's really, it looks like a spotlight is beaming out of that window.
Oh, totally.
And now, showing up to the ring. It's like a boxing moment or something.
It's completely unnatural, which is part of what I think makes it so, so memorable.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And Marin doesn't freak out. He just kind of looks up like, here I am. Let's go.
Right.
Let's do this thing.
No, it seems like when he reads the letter that gets given to him in the woods, it seems like he knows at that moment, okay, I'm going to do battle with the demon again.
Yeah, exactly. The one scene that we didn't get to talk about that I would throw out there that I hope your listeners never forget would be the dream sequence that Damien has. Yes. Where he sees his mother, and then the subway, and there's the falling amulet, and then it hits the ground, there's a scream. That whole dream sequence is amazing. I mean, to me, that's like up there with the shower scene from Psycho. It's really
well. We also get the flash frame of Pazuzu, right? That one frame moment is in there as well, and yeah, I mean, that's iconic as well. That's got to be one of the most iconic moments, because it's the first moment I think of like full surreal, otherworldly instances, and it's a dream. So it's like, are we to take it literally? Is it sort of inferring? Are we now learning sort of what the threat is and how things will play out for the rest of the movie? I agree. I love that scene.
Well, the other thing about it that I'd throw out there is that it's really it's his nightmare, and it's the only psychological insight we get throughout the whole movie that's presented to us to interpret like we were psychologists. right? Like, we don't ever see
Yeah.
Chris McNeil have a nightmare. We don't see Reagan experience the transformation into the demon. We just see his nightmare, and it speaks for itself. So that makes him like the main character of the movie for me, because we're invited to read his thoughts moving forward. And it also establishes, like you said, James, like a surrealist way of approaching this, that from this point forward, the whole film is a nightmare, and all the cinematics are done, almost like Eisenstein. It's intellectual editing. It's not realism, even though that's what Friedkin is known for. So it's just amazing. This movie's amazing, guys. It really deserves 3 or 4 episodes.
Well, as much fun as we're having talking about it, we've got to wrap this thing up. So I want to get to our votes. I want to go around. We're gonna start, and we'll let you be the third and final vote. What's the better version of this? Is it the book? Is it the movie? James, do you want to start off?
Yeah, it's I like to answer right away. So in keeping with my pattern, it's the movie. We've outlined a lot of reasons why, but I think what it ultimately comes down for me is when someone takes a material and they interpret it and then elevate it. That's usually what I look for in an adaptation. It's not a straight adaptation for beat, but it really captured exactly the essence, I think, sort of what Blatty was going for. But then Friedkin wanted to, add the ambiguity, add moments of questioning, and like allow for a lot of analysis to happen here. So it's the movie for sure.
It really is a very faithful adaptation in many ways, yet it is almost a lens, if you will, that you're viewing it through in the movie that gives it sort of different dimensions. Even though it is the same story, it feels like to me. So as much as I want to give the credit to the book, I tend to be the book guy in the podcast. I'm going to give it to the movie because it's the coming together. It's the synthesis of these two things that I think makes something that's truly sort of iconic and lasting in the movie. So yeah, movie for me as well.
Oh, I don't get to break a tie?
No, unfortunately not.
Totally the movie, but really it's the story. I think the story, I got to give Blatty the credit for the story. The structure of this is so well done. The iconography, the archetypal elements of this text, it's just so well done. The problem is that the prose of the book and the style of the book is forgettable, whereas the cinematics of this movie are unforgettable, and that's why I'm voting for the movie, not the book, even though I got to give Blatty credit and say horror writing and books are almost always superior to the film, which usually literalizes the book, treats it as like literal in their adaptation. In this case, I think The Exorcist kind of accepts the unbelievable nature of itself, but presents it in a realistic fashion. And somehow the conflict between Blatty's conservative religion and Friedkin's kind of hip 60s aesthetic, where he's kind of punking it, but taking it seriously at the same time, makes the film so good. And I'm betting that Blatty's presence in the making of the movie made all the difference. So no shame on William Peter Blatty. More power to him. He's a great guy. Thank you for the book, William Peter Blatty, but the movie is superior.
Well said, well said. Well, thank you for coming on again, Mike. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You joined us for The Thing in the past. If anybody wants to go check out that episode, or actually 2 episodes we did on The Thing with you. Also, we recently were guests in one of your classes on adaptation, and that video is available on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/ink2film, and you will be able to watch that if you're curious about it. We got interviewed about what it's been like to run a podcast on adaptations by an adaptation class.
Yeah, that was a great experience. I loved having you both in class, and that conversation with the students was amazing.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for coming on. We do want to give you a moment if you wanted to sort of like send people to your social medias and anything that you have that's out that you'd like to push towards people towards.
Well, sure. Thanks, James. My website is gorlitz.com, and that's kind of my hub for social media. And you can also find me at michaelarnzen.com. But I'm most active on Twitter and Instagram at Mike Arnzen. But I don't know how many people actually start typing those things in when they hear things like that over a podcast. I would send your listeners actually to my books and say, if you're curious about what kind of horror fiction I write, pick up a book called Proverbs for Monsters, because the lead story in that book is called Exorcist Land, and it's a story about a theme park that's based on The Exorcist.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
So check that out. And also, I wanted to give a plug to another spin-off that's more legit than mine, and that is the actual Exorcist TV series that had two seasons a couple of years ago. I don't know if a third one has come out or if it's in production. It's actually quite good, and if you appreciated that whole scene where Marin is driving up in the taxi to confront the demon Pazuzu through that spotlight in the front yard moment, it uses that brilliantly in the first season, and that's all I'm going to say about it because I don't want to spoil anything. But the first season of the TV show is actually an interesting adaptation of this kind of movie franchise, let us say.
Ooh, cool. That's another potential bonus subject for us. I like that. I like to hear that.
And you guys are amazing. Great insights into the film. I learned some new things. I'm going to rob some of your ideas when I teach this again in the year.
The feeling is mutual. We're going to take everything you said and act as if it's ours to our friends and family and like tell everybody, look how smart we are. So thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, guys, and long live The Exorcist. The power of Christ compels me.
So if you enjoyed that episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever podcast app you use. It's a great way to get in touch with us and also get the word out. So we love to see them.
And also connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. And make sure to join the Council of Inklings because we post polls, we post articles that we find about upcoming adaptations. And it's just a great way to stay engaged and like talk about adaptation and sort of films or books that are coming out.
And if you'd like to support this podcast, check us out on Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm. We have bonus episodes on there. We just put out a new one recently. It's early access to some adaptation news, horror news, and also us talking about ghost stories, some things that actually happened to us, trying to look back on them. For bringing in particular, something that happened to me as a child, I talk about on there. So if that sounds interesting to you, check it out, patreon.com/inktofilm.
And thank you once again to our fabulous guest, Mike Arnzen. We really appreciated you coming back on and telling us all about horror and the history behind it.
Yeah, anytime I can talk to my former mentor from Seton Hill is a great time. He just knows so much. I love it. So thank you again to Mike. Definitely check out his books, check out his social media, follow him on Twitter, all of that. And until next time.
Thanks for listening.